Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last talk that we have in October 2025. And our speaker today is Thea Johansson. And Thea is going to tell us about Voices in Metal, a phonetic perspective, which I believe was Thea's MA thesis project at Lund University.
Right, I guess I'll take over then. Yeah, so I've called my talk today Voices in Metal, a Phonetic Perspective. And I'll talk about multiple ones, but mainly growling, because my thesis was mainly on growling, and mainly specifically on tongue and jaw movement in growling. Uh, so this I got really interested in this from the perspective of articulatory phonetics and reading about how the larynx and the oral articulators interact when we speak. And I also, as you maybe can guess, I do listen to metal and I read about it out of interest. And I saw that there's a lot that we don't know about metal. And I think that, or about growling and other voice qualities in metal. And I think that looking at it in a phonetic perspective can clear some things up, and also it can teach us really cool things about the voice. So it's, I believe, mutually beneficial to linguists and to vocalists. Uh, right. I'd like to just start by providing some background into the phonetic theory that my project is anchored in. And some of you probably know all this already. Depends on how involved you are in phonetics specifically versus just voice studies, perhaps. Um, but voice quality as a term in linguistics can be understood in a more narrow sense or in a broader sense. So in the narrowest sense, uh, the voice and voice qualities are sort of conceptualized to arise from a single place, the vocal folds, and then you have the more open posture, which then if there's so there's more openness between the vocal folds. Well, then you go towards breathy voice and eventually breath. And then the opposite way, if there's more constriction, then you get creaky voice and eventually closure. And this is sort of very fits very well into source filter theory, which I'm sure you all know, where the larynx, it has one job, it's a single place, it generates voice, and then that voice is modified by the oral articulators above it. But you can also see voice quality in a broader sense. So instead of this sort of horizontal view of motor voice in the middle and then the others on the side, um, you can see it as to do in, for example, the laryngeal articulator model, where our laryngeal articulator, so it's no longer just a pace voice, it's an articulator. It's sort of metaphorically made up of six valves, where valve one is at the very bottom, that's the vocal folds, and then you have the other valves above it. And so then one voice quality is actually, it arises from constriction at these valves in a certain way. So it's like a posture throughout the entire vocal tract. Uh, yes. Let me make sure that I got everything. Okay. Yeah. So here I've just written out the six valves really, really briefly. So valve one, the vocal folds, and then we have the ventricular folds, and then the audioepiglottic folds. So three folds, one, two, three. And then here's my main interest, vowel 4, the tongue and the epiglottis. And then 5 and 6, we can see what that is. Basically, the main point here is that now one voice quality, which can be produced in multiple ways, can be systematically described. So in the previous view, you know, harsh voice, also creaky voice, those are voice qualities which can be produced with the ventricular and or epiglottic folds involved. But that's sort of not taken into account systematically. But now we can describe harsh voice as a voice quality produced at vowels 1, 2, and 3, depending on pitch and such. So voice quality at high pitched is sort of pressed voice where the vocal folds are tied together, but harsh voice at low pitch. Well, then you can have epiglottic trilling, and yeah, they're all encapsulated within there. Yeah. Yes, I just wanted to show this picture as well, which I have clearly borrowed, because I think it shows the idea behind the laryngeal articulator model really well, where we have in the top view here the oral articulator and then the laryngeal articulator down here. So now you can kind of imagine how the valves are aligned. And they're all describing here. So valve 5, for example, raises and lowers the larynx. Again, very much a short description of this. Yes, lowering the larynx is a possibility. We're mainly describing, though, the state from a completely open vocal tract to full closure here. So if you imagine the vocal folds closing, the ventricular folds, and then up throughout the tract like that. And the main interest here for me, tongue and epiglottis, that is the retracted movement pointed out in the tongue. So let's say you have a voice quality, you want to produce epiglottic trilling, then the tongue movement and epiglottis sort of moved in a retract with the tongue retraction towards the pharyngeal wall, so you can have complete closure up there. So then we can see how the tongue becomes sort of involved in the process of constriction, which starts in the larynx, right? So about the tongue then, the hyoglossus is the tongue muscle that retracts or is responsible for the retraction. And it is also then very much part of valve 4 in the laryngeal articulator model. Interesting here thing here too, I've tested multiple vowels in my project. And vowels, there is a suggestion by John Essling in the paper from 2005, we can see later, where he sort of suggests that we change how we describe vowels. So in the view of the laryngeal articulator model, the vowels which are normally described as open and backed are better described as retracted because they're produced by retracting the tongue. And the vowels which are backed and more closed, they are raised because they are raised with the styloglossus. And then the genioglossus being the muscle that is mainly for fronted, or like pointing the tongue, moving the tongue body forward a little bit. Very interesting connection here with growling is with harsh voice. So there is a study which shows that what harshness, perceived harshness, increases the more a vowel is retracted, i.e., if you look at harsh voiced produced with different vowels, it will sound harsher with the more retracted vowels in this, like, if we look at vowels according to Lam and reconceptualize them like that. In this vein too, if we look at harsh voice generally, we see more tongue retraction in harsh voice compared to modal voice then. And then for the jaw, we see a connection that when there is laryngeal constriction, the jaw also tends to be more lowered. And another interesting connection, so we've seen that previously, right? If you lower the jaw, that can lower the F0 a little bit. So that's a really interesting connection between, like, because we think that the jaw and pitch might be quite separate things because they're far away from each other. But there are some things to suggest that there are actually mechanical connections going on, though we don't know exactly what that is. Another thing that suggests this is a study by Erickson et al. They looked at emphasis in American English in vowels, and they found that during emphasized vowels, the jaw was lowered and the pitch was higher, and the jaw was also protruded. So Erickson et al. Sort of tentatively hypothesized that the jaw protrusion would mechanically sort of counteract this tendency to lower the F0 when we lower the jaw. So yeah, there are many interesting things here happening between the tongue's movements and constriction, as well as the jaw's movements, constriction and pitch. So this is also how I got interested in testing growling based on these things, because growling is a voice quality that uses a lot of constriction. Yes. Right. So briefly on what is growl, I have listed a couple of genres that show up if when I've looked for studies on growl, what shows up, and also a whole bunch of artists which growl. So we can see that growl is a relatively broad term, right? It describes something that Christina Aguilera does and that Chris Barnes from Cannibal Corpse does, and also some traditional music and folk music. So that's fun. But I was specifically interested in growling in metal. So Arch Enemy is also an example artist here if you want to look up later. Unless you're already growl enthusiasts and you love metal, I don't know. Right. So how is growl produced? Well, broadly, I would say, based on previous research, these three valves are involved in producing growl. It can be summarized like this. So one study, they used EGG and also some laryngeoscopy, but not simultaneously. They found ventricular and or aryepiglottic vibration. They couldn't really see if there was ever simultaneous ventricular or aryepiglottic vibration, but broadly two growls, you can say. And then some other studies have shown that there is vibration throughout the vocal tract, but with no oscillation anywhere. And this is an interesting thing to mention here, is that the study with the first finding, they were investigating what they called growl or death growl. The second study is studies that either explicitly investigate grunting as it is described in complete vocal technique, or they've just used some of their background is based on complete vocal technique. Perhaps you've heard of complete vocal technique. I believe this has been, it has some connection to Denmark at least, but it's a vocal paradigm, right? A vocal paradigm for basically it's supposed to be for teaching different vocal styles or vocal effects. And they have growling in complete vocal technique, but that's more the Christina Aguilera style. So this is for grunting in complete vocal technique. Right. Finally, what I'd like to say here, at least one study seems to have found evidence of vocal fold oscillation during growling. Other studies hypothesize that it might be the case that you cannot even have any kind of oscillation during growling. So this is mainly the style with the vibration throughout the vocal tract, but with no oscillation anywhere. And then the idea is, well, there's such high air velocity in growling. You need such high air velocity to set these supraglottic structures into movement that you couldn't use, or they couldn't be voice as such. But we have other studies which kind of find something else. And yeah, I suspect that they're looking at maybe slightly different things, or that there could be variation to how growling is produced. Yeah. My study. Right, this is just a fun picture. It doesn't represent where I placed the sensors. But yeah, this is me in the electromagnetic articulograph at the Lund University Humanities Lab. So as you've probably inferred, I used the electromagnetic articulography for this project. I didn't growl personally either. Again, this is just a fun picture. I had two male participants who were amateur vocalists but had been growling regularly for many years. They each produced modal voice and in their words, two different kinds of growl. So my first participant produced what he considered his main growl, and then another growl which was a modification of his main growl. And my second participant produced his main growl, which in his mind was Florida style growling. And here he is, no, Gothenburg style growling. And here is referring to a style of death metal which was sort of invented, or which Gothenburg at least is famous for. They invented it too, kind of. And the growling in that. And then his second style of growl was a Florida style death metal growl. So associated with Florida in the United States. And I recorded them doing this in multiple vowels, in 4 vowels. And I've looked at the vertical and horizontal movements of the tongue dorsum and of the jaw in modal voice and in the 2 different growls. Right. So very generally speaking, this is the p-values that I've gotten from an LMM model. And broadly speaking, there is a significant difference between modal voice and growling. And when I look at the visualization of the data, all of the data that was used for the statistical test suggests that, yes, the tongue dorsum is more retracted, so it's more lower and back, and the jaw is more lower in growling compared to modal voice. So it agrees with the sort of suspicions that we had earlier. I also checked if it varied by vowel, and that was one of my hypotheses, was that all vowels would be affected by the tongue retraction, because I'm expecting that growling will employ vowel four to some degree and thereby retract the tongue to some degree, regardless of vowel, in order to even produce the growl. And that seems to be true. We see the LMM told me that, or my LMM model became better when I added vowel as a slope to it. However, the visualization of the data really only shows that, well, the vowels are affected differently in the sense that here the R vowel, which I have written here, was least affected. And that you can also see if you compare it with E, E was most affected, which is perhaps not so surprising because R is a what you would consider an open back vowel, the most open back vowel. And so it's already produced with the higher glosses, which is responsible for retracting. So there is retraction already in that sense, versus E, a closed fronted vowel, which wouldn't have that normally. So it would probably be pulled back a bit more, right? I did have one outlier in the L1 dataset, and here I'm referring to a dataset which I didn't have time to do anything with, really. So both of my participants were actually the English, the testing is done in English. Their first languages were Italian and Greek. So I have recorded them in their first language as well, but that's not included in statistics, and I didn't have time to do anything with it. I did visualize the L1 data though, and there is one outlier, which we'll look at in a moment. But first, here's an example of the visualization. This is mean coordinates of the vertical tongue dorsal movements in modal voice, which is to the right, and then their second growl is at the middle and the first growl is to the left. So yeah, and then all the individual lines are individual vowels. So here we can see another interesting thing too. Both of their GA, their standard growls, so this is the standard growl for one participant or the Gothenburg style growl for the other participants. It's slightly less, the tongue dorsum is slightly less lower than in their second growl. And this second growl is the modified growl to sound lower for the first participant, or the Florida style for the second participant. I sort of for me, there's nothing in research to suggest this exactly in previous research, but I sort of grouped them like this to see because I had the suspicion that maybe their second growl would be a bit more retracted. This is also the case for the jaw. All the visualizations for the jaw look the same, and I think it's because there could be a connection with the lowering of F0 and the opening of the jaw and the constriction, which is sort of very connected to lower F0. So we have, yeah, like lower harsh voice at low pitch, then you can have a constriction at the epiglottic folds. So there's a connection between sort of lower F0 and more constriction. So I would see more dramatic results in a growl that is intended to sound lower, or I suspect in a Florida style growl, because if you don't listen to metal music or death metal, you probably don't know this, but in Gothenburg style growling, it tends to be a little easier to hear what they're saying, tends to be a bit more like has a smoothness to it, but Florida style growling very much sounds like intense noise and a little lower and nothing else. And here is the outlier, and it's actually on the horizontal plane. So this is the participant, this is the Italian. And we can see that the fourth vowel, so the Italian U vowel, it's the tongue dorsum is a bit more fronted rather than retracted. And I thought it was interesting how this happened. I have a suspicion which I cannot confirm based on my data, but I am sort of wondering if this participant had a growl or mostly growled with just the ventricular folds somehow as the main noise generators. Because this participant also, when like in the room, um, was not nearly as loud as the other participant. The other participant was yeah, really loud, took slightly deeper breaths. And this participant had a little bit more of a smooth sound. It wasn't too much louder than uh, a speaking voice, actually. But if you have a thought on why this might have happened, I'd be interested in hearing. Right. I'd like to summarize a bit and talk about where I think this could go. So one thing I have not looked at is vertical laryngeal movement, because actually the movement of the larynx up, this was also part of, this was well 5 in the laryngeal articulator model, right? The vertical movement of the larynx up is sort of has synergistically connected to laryngeal constriction. So I'm wondering if you'd see vertical laryngeal movement upwards during growl, or if they teach themselves to lower the larynx, which is possible, in order to modify the sound. And I'm also wondering if it's connected to uh, this problem of voiced versus voicelessness in growling, because you can, when you vertically lower the larynx, you can create a little gap between the ventricular and vocal folds. So then I'm wondering if you can create a gap and then use the vocal folds to sing while growling effectively. But I don't know. No one's looked at that. And I would also very much like to observe what happens more closely. So I'm applying for PhDs, and I am uh, I have an idea for a study which involves real-time magnetic research imaging. So I think that would be really interesting to follow in detail what happens step by step throughout the larynx. Also investigate variations of growl and how those relate to tongue and jaw movements. And I think the describing um, growling in a bit more of the vein that I've done and that you can do with the laryngeal articulator model is also makes it easier for researchers to replicate studies and continue, because now it's it's kind of difficult to discern sometimes what researchers are investigating. So in one study I was reading, they recognize growl as, but they recognize metal as like a genre that growl can happen in. And then they say they want to investigate that, but then they recruit rock singers, and then it's a bit muddled. I think we need to have like some words that can mean, we can establish some words that can mean some things. But that's, of course, this is always a bit of a problem in research, but I'll try. I think it would be interesting with airflow velocity and subglottal pressure, especially because this is also something that can be a problem in studies. Like in my study, my participants had to sit down because they had to be in the uh, uh, EMA, right? But they sort of described that this made it. One person said they felt like they lose contact with the body like that, and I'm thinking that some of the results maybe could be negatively influenced, like maybe they hyper articulate the growl more than they would have to like compensate for lack of airflow or something along those lines. And it's something that I think about a lot in the future if I'm going to do something with real-time MRI, or how does laying down affect their ability to growl. And yeah, if you have thoughts on like, or things about the effect of being in different position upon like the airflow and throughout the body, that would be really interesting to hear about from my perspective. The problem of the voice growl I've talked a bit about, and then finally screaming. I haven't even got to screaming, and I can't find too much on it. Um, and I'm wondering, since if you think about screaming as like kind of like a growl, but at a higher pitch, do we also find jaw protrusion because it mechanically counteracts something? I think that would be an interesting next step because it seems even less defined in previous research than growling as well. So it's probably whatever I do is going to be very new, I think. Yes, and a whole bunch of references for today and some other interested readings in case they want to see. Yeah, that's pretty much it.